Hello people, how's it going? Scotty. So as we know, Margaret Thatcher was one of the most controversial recent political figures in our history. She was one of the most hated, I would argue to say one of the most misunderstood, similar to that of Ronald Reagan.
I'm no communist, I'll tell you that right now. I believe a man should own his own house and car and cow. I like this private ownership, I want to be left alone. Let the government run its business and let me run my own.
So we can understand that during the Second World War there would have been a strong period of centralisation. However, this was to be a temporary measure, or supposed to be a temporary measure, something that the Labour Party tried to make permanent.
Well-wishers besiege Caxton Hall, London, for the wedding of Britain's popular Foreign Secretary, Mr. Anthony Eden, to Miss Clarissa Spencer Churchill.
In the post-war period, the Tory party was still run by the upper classes.
Macmillan's best example, Alec Douglas, Hume, Eden, these were people from very posh backgrounds.
The upper-class Tory establishment agreed with Labour socialists that the state should directly control much of the economy. This was called the post-war consensus. The extent of nationalisation under both Labour and Tory governments was breathtaking. The ports and the docks and shipbuilding were nationalised. The trains and the railways, freight transport, canals, ferries and buses were nationalised. The airports and airlines, car, bus, truck and airplane manufacturing, the coal industry, the oil industry, the gas industry, the steel industry, iron, water, electricity were all nationalised. Telecommunications were nationalised, much of the computer industry, radio and television were nationalised. The government even took over some pubs and the travel agent Thomas Cook. Britain, once the world's leading capitalist industrial nation, became one of the most state-owned of any country outside the communist world.
The Labour Party came to power in 1945-46, and of course along they stepped in with all this strong nationalisation. Most of the British economy had been nationalised.
You might wake up in the morning and brush your teeth with state water, get into your state-produced car, avoiding state-produced lorries and buses. You might pick up your state telephone, phone the state travel agent, book a holiday taking off from a state airport in a state-produced aircraft, and so it went on. You could go through the entire day without ever contacting the free enterprise side of the economy.
And it was really all thanks to all that strong nationalisation and all the printing of fiat currency out of thin air, the skyrocketing inflation that would have led to Britain's mess in the 1970s.
Crisis? What crisis? Crisis? What crisis? Crisis? What crisis?
In the 1970s, of course, Britain faced a shortage at the pump in 1974.
Just start working now, otherwise we won't have time. We're going to be out of oil within a few years.
Natural gas is getting short, everything's getting short, and unless we can harness the power of the sun, it's going to run out eventually. Again,
that would have been due to the price controls, and then there was the blackouts, and last but not least, in 1978, the Winter of Discontent.
Labour had won the general election of October 1974 with an overall majority of just 3 seats. Quite soon that majority crumbled, and for years the government survived only by striking deals with the smaller parties, including a fully fledged pact with the Liberals. That ended in 1978 when the Liberals left the pact. The government had lost its majority. After the strikes and the power cuts, and facing an increasingly confident Conservative opposition, Jim Callaghan found that his luck had run out.
In the Winter of Discontent, the British economy was on the verge of an economic collapse. Yet there it was, Margaret Thatcher was blamed for all of this, despite the fact that the economy was on the verge of an economic collapse, and Thatcher didn't take over until after that period. She became the Prime Minister in May 1979.
Yes, technically this is a party political broadcast on behalf of the Conservative Party. But tonight I don't propose to use the time to make party political points. I don't think you'd want me to do so. The crisis that our country faces is too serious for that. And it is our country, the whole nation, that faces this crisis, not just one party or even one government. This is no time to put party before country. I start from there. Of course there are major political differences between the parties, just as there are between many of you sitting at home. But I believe there are some things which should not divide us. None of us wants to see our country torn apart. Some of the things I've seen on television and read in the newspapers and heard directly from you in factories and shopping centres make me wonder what has happened to our sense of common nationhood and even of common humanity. We've seen strikes called before agreements have ended. We've seen them used as a weapon of first resort, not as the last step after everything else has failed. We've seen industrial action directed straight at the public to make you suffer, directed even at the sick and the disabled. That sort of action damages the reputation of all trade unionists, most of whom wouldn't agree with it. We've seen picketing that threatens to bring the country to its knees, emptying our shops, endangering our farms, closing our factories, taking our jobs. Picketing was meant to be about peaceful persuasion at the scene of the dispute. The result of recent legislation and practice is that today almost any determined group can strangle the country. So here we are, just 2 weeks into 1979, with some of our towns and cities, especially in the North and Midlands, looking as though they're under siege, with many people, the old and those with young children, suffering real hardship, some even without water, while export orders are locked in and food rots at the docks. Of course, the storm may blow itself out and things may start to get better. I hope with all my heart they do. But even if that happens, the underlying problems will still be there. And if the past is any guide, what's happened this winter could happen again next winter and the winter after that and so on. What we face is a threat to our whole way of life.
So with the economy being on the verge of an economic collapse, it just so happened to be that going into Thatcher's era as Prime Minister, as she became the Prime Minister, she was blamed for the extremely high inflation and, of course, the extremely high unemployment of the early 1980s.
Crisis? What crisis? Crisis? What crisis? Crisis? What crisis? Crisis? What crisis?
And of course, one of the documentaries that I had recently watched, one of the narrators blamed Thatcher for the lack of productivity. Now what that tells you is that these people simply do not understand the basics of economics, because they clearly don't understand what a recession is.
By the end of 1980, unemployment had nearly doubled. Manufacturing output had fallen by a sixth. Britain was declining faster than even in the darkest days of the 1930s. Despite this, the politicians were convinced they were right.
So the reason why it's so important to understand what a recession is simply because people, as I say, get the wrong idea. If they don't understand something, they'll point the blame at another problem, and they'll persist on supporting essentially what creates the very problem they're pissing and moaning about. And it just so happens to be that because Thatcher was the Prime Minister, how convenient, they would blame her for the extremely high unemployment rate. And it was the same with the extremely high costs, the inflation. They would blame her for all the high prices. You know, it's all Margaret Thatcher's fault for all the high prices. It's all her fault for, you know, all the blackouts. It's all her fault for, you know, the high unemployment, the low level of productivity. And one of the narrators of a documentary I had recently watched, he was blaming Margaret Thatcher, surprisingly. He was blaming her for the lack of productivity from 1980 to 81. What's the problem with that? Well, it's in relation to what we would call a recession. So a recession is basically where your economy would grind to a halt. That means all your level of productivity would grind to a halt. In other words, your level of productivity would drastically decrease. So this is nothing at all to do with Margaret Thatcher. The recession began in 1978 in the Winter of Discontent. That's when the recession began. And when the level of productivity decreases due to the economy grinding to a halt, then of course it all relates to this thing with supply and demand. It's like I've said so many times before, and it would take me, quite a bit to go into. I briefly touched upon it in a video on prices, so please go and check that out. Plus I've done another video you can also check out on supply and demand itself, where I've argued this till blue in the face. All you need to understand is that with the lack of productivity, the costs of your goods and services increase. And it just so happens to be that during a recession, this is a period where, because costs are increasing and inflating, then consumers are more cautious over how they spend their money. Okay, so consumers begin to save more. And due to the consumers saving more of their money, they're more cautious over how they spend their money. And this is the trend that you tend to see during a recession, and this does hurt companies. And the reason why it hurts companies is because when the recession hits and the economy grinds to a halt and the productivity levels drastically decrease, the costs of the goods and services increase with that, they inflate with it, and this forces businesses, because they can't afford it, this forces businesses to downsize. And the unfortunate thing is that people end up getting paid off. And that's essentially what happened. The recession began in in the Winter of Discontent in 1978, before, of course, May 1979, when Thatcher took over as Prime Minister. That's when the recession began, and you can see this from this line graph evidence here. You can start to see the rise of the inflation, and of course with a good bit of research you can find for yourself when the recession began. It began in 1978. And there's nothing that Thatcher could do about that. All she could do was do the best that she could during a period when the recession hit. So it was one of these things that in the year 1980, when of course there was a severe lack of productivity, the lack of manufacturing, you can't expect Thatcher to reverse the economy, reverse the economic mess within a year or two, especially during a period of where the recession hit. And that just so happened to be the point in history of where the unemployment rate had skyrocketed. And it wasn't just because of the recession. It wasn't just because due to the prices inflating and businesses being forced to downsize. You think about this for a second. Let's imagine you were running a business and you are, struggling enough as it is, and your prices are shooting through the roof simply because of the recession, the lack of productivity, and things are going up in terms of prices, and you're forced to downsize as businesses. Think about this. How would you feel if the trade union Congress stepped in and bombed your business with extremely high taxation to redistribute to remaining workers?
We all know, in the last 5 years, the living standards of people in this country just have not grown the way they could. The Labour government's explanation for this is that Britain has been suffering because the whole world has been suffering. Well, the fact is that the world did have a bit of a cold, but it seems to be getting over the worst of it. In Britain, that cold seems to have turned into double pneumonia. Look at France. Between 1974 and 1978, the average French worker saw his wages, in terms of what they would buy, go up by 60%. In Germany, the average worker saw his real wages go up by over 92%. The average Italian worker saw his real wages go up by over 47%. Meanwhile, in Britain, the average industrial worker has seen his real wages, in terms of what they will buy, only go up by 16%. And it isn't just the French, Germans and Italians who've done better. The British worker has also done worse than, for example, workers in Denmark, Belgium, Canada.
So with businesses already being forced to downsize due to a recession, in other words, people getting laid off, unfortunately, therefore the higher unemployment rate during the early period of the 1980s, you then had the companies and industries being bombed by that high taxation by the Trade Union Congress. And this was because the Trade Union Congress was aiming, although through good intentions, you would say through good intentions, but it doesn't mean to say that good intentions have the good consequences.
It's not that they don't care about the unemployed, they do. And it's not that they don't mean well for our health service or our old people, of course they do. The Labour Party has always expressed the best intentions in these areas. But it's no good having good intentions if you can't afford to carry them out. You can't pay for better social services with good intentions. Caring that works costs cash. It all seems to come down to one thing: money, and the policies which create it. Labour never seem to have enough. Strange, you might think, when we're paying more tax under this present Labour government than ever before. But despite all this tax they're collecting, they still haven't got enough to pay for the proper standards of social services. And they never can get enough coming in from tax when people aren't earning enough in the first place. So the Labour government has to take more and more of what we do earn to try and pay for the schools, hospitals and social services we all want.
You really have to think about the consequences of your actions. It's not all about having good intentions. And it just happens to be that when the Trade Union Congress bombed the companies and industries with high taxation during a period when consumers are cutting back on how much they're spending, that means less money being spent in companies. Also, with the companies and industries costs driving up due to the recession with low levels of productivity. Companies and industries during a period of this, when they're already downsizing and paying people off, the Trade Union Congress hits them with high taxation, which is further hurting their profits. And what do you think happens when you are hurting a business by hitting them with high taxation, and you're hurting their profits, especially when consumers are spending less? Well, what do you think a business is going to do? A business is going to compensate for those losses. It's going to compensate basically by driving up its costs, right? So that's essentially what happened. These businesses are then forced to drive their costs up further to try and make up for the loss they're paying out in high taxation.
We've always had a sense of humour, and heaven knows we've needed it lately. But we've other characteristics too. A gift for invention, for initiative and for hard work. Under Labour, these talents are going to waste because the government takes too much away in tax. How often do you hear people say, look how much they've taken from my pay packet? So naturally they ask for bigger pay rises to make up the difference. And it's not long before that pushes up prices. Ask any housewife, she'll tell you. This government has increased prices more and faster than any other government since records were kept. The only way to keep prices down is to get production up. And you don't do that by weighing people down with taxes and other restrictions. They don't work for the chance of the exchequer. They work for their families. So we've got to cut the tax on earnings and the tax on skill. Give our people incentives. And once again, Britain will be back in the race.
Although it's good intentions, the socialists are thinking, oh well, we can bomb the businesses with this high taxation, we can just redistribute it to the remaining workers. What do we mean by the remaining workers? Well, the Trade Union Congress regulated businesses and industries to how many employers they could have. In other words, they limited businesses and industries to how many they could employ. What do you think that's doing? It's, causing an even bigger problem simply because the fact that there's already a high unemployment rate due to people having been paid off. If you're going to limit businesses to how many people they could employ, you're keeping people out of work. And that's essentially what the Trade Union Congress did. They limited businesses and industries to how many people they could employ through their regulation. And most importantly is the very fact that the Trade Union Congress blackmailed non-union members to finding work. In other words, the Trade Union Congress said, if you do not become a union member through blackmail, then of course you won't find any work with us at all that we're involved with. So it came of no surprise why later into the 1980s, when Thatcher ended the Trade Union Congress, because Thatcher fought long and hard against the trade unions because they were damaging. When Thatcher fought long and hard and she put an end to the Trade Union Congress, that alone had created 3 million plus jobs. Now we'll get to that very soon, because you will see for yourself from the line graph evidence that unemployment levels were decreasing, just so happens to be in that period of history. But you can see, if you're running companies and industries and you're forced to downsize due to a recession that socialism had caused, not because of Thatcher. The recession began in 1978 in the Winter of Discontent. If you're faced with a recession, you're forced to downsize, and then you're being hit with high taxation to redistribute tax to pay the higher wages for remaining workers, these businesses again are forced to drive up their costs to compensate for that. Thus, when you drive up your costs, who are you scaring away? You're scaring away your consumers. When prices go up, demand goes down. When prices go down, demand goes up. During a recession, when consumers are already cautious over how they spend their money, what do you think consumers are going to do when they see businesses with high costs? They look at the businesses and think to themselves, can't afford that. Therefore, I'm going to look elsewhere and see if I can get it cheaper. They're cautious over how they spend their money. And so the Trade Union Congress more or less hammered the nail into their coffin. That's why so many of the, businesses ended up going under because of that. Because they're being forced to downsize due to a recession. They're being hit from the Trade Union Congress, and then as if the regulation limiting businesses to how many people they could employ, as if that wasn't bad enough. The Trade Union Congress is blackmailing non-union members, saying you won't find work with us unless you become a union member. That is blackmail. And this is the problem, because when it came to 1984, 1985, you then had the issue where these failing industries that were long into decline were then being closed down, which was further unemployment. And again, this is something else that they blame Thatcher for. So I'm going to show you something. which is very important because in 1978, as I said, the economy was on the verge of an economic collapse. Now, this, as I said, was before Margaret Thatcher, and it was all because of the heavy nationalisation of the economy, as the Labour Party had strongly nationalised the economy in 1945 onwards. So due to the strong nationalisation, we can even see from evidence in history that the central bank was nationalised in the early 1960s. All this nationalisation led the British economy into that severe mess. And why is that? It's because the private sector is basically what funds the public sector. It's not the public sector that finances the private sector. People who work in the public sector are paid their wages by the government. And of course, the public sector, as we know, does not pay taxation. They don't generate enough to pay tax. They simply pay what we call a rebate. That means that the public sector, people who work for the public sector, are paying a percentage back to what the government initially gave them in the first place. And who's the real government? The real government are the taxpayers who work for the private sector. That's the real government. It's the people, working in the private sector. But as I said, due to the Labour Party having strongly nationalised the economy, then of course where else was the government going to get the money from? There was barely a private sector left.
Mrs. Thatcher,
Mrs. Thatcher was finally elected to Parliament in 1959.
Talk of the front bench. How do you feel about that?
Well, I think we'll just try to be a very good backbencher first.
It was a grim time for Britain. According to the post-war consensus, nationalisation would bring prosperity. But instead, Britain suffered a period of rapid decline.
The problem with state industries was basically that being a monopoly, funded from the public purse, they didn't have to try. Private enterprise keeps itself efficient and cost-effective because otherwise people will turn to their competition and they'll go broke.
When you work in an environment like that and you see it day in, day out, you can see what's going on. The management, what was looking after the works, just didn't care about the costs. They just let it go because they knew that if they lost money, the government would pay for it.
By the 1970s, state-owned Britain was on its knees, outdated and overmanned. The nationalised industries were making huge losses. They were not producing wealth, they were consuming it. Britain, once the workshop of the world, was now the sick man of Europe.
British Steel, British Telecom, British Gas, it doesn't matter. If it had the word British in front of it, it was basically nationalised and was completely on its backside. And it represented where the country was as well. The country was on its backside.
So, due to the lack of the private sector, the government was financing the economy off the back of the fiat currency, off the back of the printing press. And the reason this is so important to note is because this will explain the high costs prior to Thatcher leading into the 1980s and why the recession hit, why Britain was driving towards hyperinflation. It wasn't because of Thatcher. It was because of the Labour Party, with all the heavy nationalisation, due to the lack of the private sector, they were forced to finance off the back of the printing press. Money only comes from two places. It only comes from either the private sector or the printing press. And it just so happened to be, as I said, Labour Party heavy nationalisation of the economy. It just so happened to be that it was the printing press. And during that period, there was financial repression. Therefore, you saw extremely high inflation. That's because all that money borrowed from the United States, they're having to pay all that money back. So it was a period of financial repression. But most importantly, the Labour Party printing vast sums of money out of thin air from the printing press to finance the entire economy with all their heavy nationalisation. What do you think that was doing? As I explained before, it's every £1 to the value of the product. as it is every $1 to the value of the product. For every £1 that you print, or every $1 you print, there is a 1+ debt added to the currency. The more you print in circulation, the lower the valuation of the currency. The lower the valuation of the currency due to the more paper in circulation, as it is every £1 to the value of the product, or $1 to the value of the product. The more paper you print in circulation, the less scarce it becomes, thus the lower the value the currency has. What effect does that have? The effect that has is it drives the costs of your goods and services up. Your prices inflate because the paper is driving down in valuation. That's why what you could have bought for £10 50 odd years ago, you could have bought far more. And that's the reason why, you know, you could barely fill your basket today, your trolley today, with $10 or £10. Simply because of the fact of what we call inflation. All because of Labour parties and Democrat parties, you know, vast increase of the paper fiat currency being printed out of thin air. And that's why you need the private sector to finance the economy. You can't finance an economy off the back of a printing press. And that's what drives you towards hyperinflation. Because once you devalue the valuation of the currency so much, there becomes a point where people lose faith in the currency. And when people lose faith in the currency is left in circulation, and a large sum of it, which then you're left with extremely high inflation, where it reaches 10% and it spirals out of control. Thatcher was left with no option during the 1980s to save Britain from hyperinflation. She had no choice but to sell off the oil industry, because if she never, Britain was facing something catastrophic, something far worse than what people could imagine. People don't understand what hyperinflation seems, or shall I say, they don't understand what it is. It's basically where your inflation skyrockets so much, it comes out of control from the government to the point your whole society would break into riots, fighting over one another for food, breaking into shops. Across the whole of Britain, it would have been catastrophic, and they would have blamed Thatcher for that. But what you have to understand is that due to the lack of the private sector, due to the heavy nationalisation, that's where the Labour Party was getting all of its money from, the printing press. This is important to understand because Jeremy Corbyn wants to do exactly this.
So Jeremy, so there's issues that we agree on, and Jeremy's you're trying to look for another camera to read the question. There are issues that we agree on that we should oppose George Osborne's 40% cuts. But the issue that I've raised concern with you about is your proposal for the Bank of England to print money to pay for schools or transport. In those circumstances, do you believe that the government would have to pay that money back to the Bank of England, or do you think that this is free money?
We put £385 billion worth of money called quantitative easing into the banks to bail them out in 2008. We bought bank shares and put them in a holding company, some of which Osborne is now selling off, and he shouldn't because they're not his to sell, they're ours to keep. And my suggestion is that some of that quantitative easing ought to be made available together with other sources such as government bonds to fund a national investment bank so that we have a growing economy which can improve the infrastructure in all parts of the UK, particularly the rail infrastructure, also be able to fund the very necessary housing building, particularly council house building that this country desperately is crying out for, and an efficient and effective and inexpensive way of funding public investment rather than the private finance initiatives which have been pursued by both this government and the last government, which are costing so much, so dear in both the NHS and in education. It's not inflationary. Japan used quantitative easing after 10 years of a flatlining economy in order to boost growth. I would have thought it's a sensible and reasonable precautionary thing to do.
But you haven't answered the question.
Yes, I have.
Because actually, no, you haven't. Because actually what you're offering people is false hope. For a start, let me finish. For a start, quantitative easing has stopped because the economy is now growing. The reason that Japan was able to keep going and doing it for many years is because they went into slump, serious slump for a long term. It's absolutely right to support the economy when it is in crisis and when it is in a serious recession. But once the economy is growing, if you simply keep printing money at that time, that pushes up inflation. Second thing is that when the Bank of England prints that money, and even through the quantitative easing, it has to still be paid back.
You see, it was due to that drove Britain towards the mess in the 1970s. It's the very reason why Britain had faced the Winter of Discontent in 1978. So, what I'm going to show to you is something in relation with regards to the industries. Now in Scotland it was the Ravenscraig industries, it was the shipbuilding, the coal and the steel industries. These industries had long been in decline since the 1920s. And they had been in decline simply because the economy was on a transition, because Britain could not afford, the British government couldn't do anything about it. They couldn't afford the industrialised based economy. The economy was on the transition from the industrialised based economy to the consumer driven based economy. And the government couldn't do anything about that. So what I'm going to show to you is an example, because in that year of 1978, with the economy being on the verge of an economic collapse, the coal industry was costing the British taxpayer £1 billion per year.
Margaret was very blunt. You always knew exactly what she thought, and she was straight with the British people.
I like to be straight, I like to be clear, I like to be honest.
Well, that's why she was so popular.
Her supporters admired her steely resolve. Her enemies feared it.
By the end of next month,
Mrs. Thatcher was determined to dismantle state control. Many in the loss-making nationalised industries would lose their jobs. Some industries, like shipbuilding, would shrink to a fraction of their former size.
This isn't even talking about the likes of the British Rail. Look at the British Rail as a prime example. The British Rail was running at nearly a £1 billion deficit. Added to that, the extremely high costs, the endless strikes, the outdated trains, the lack of passenger journeys through British Rail. All of that is the reason why you saw strikes in the first place. So the extremely high costs existed prior to Thatcher. So it's very important to understand that history, because Thatcher was not the fault of it. And it just so happens to be that the coal industry was in decline, as I said, since the 1920s. Now, what I'm going to show you is the reasons why this was. One of the main reasons was the rise of oil and then gas and nuclear as cleaner alternative sources of power. Another was the decline of the heavy industries that depended upon coal. Now, if there's heavy industries that go into decline that coal depends upon, then of course the coal industry itself is taking a heavy hit. And this is what we mean. It's propping up a failing industry, one that was going out the door. And we can see this by the other example. The domestic heating had moved away from coal, and North Sea gas replaced coal gas. You think about that. The 1970s, of course, was the years when Britain started drilling for oil. That alone would have taken a heavy hit on the coal industry. So you think if it's costing the British taxpayer £1 billion per year and the economy is on the verge of an economic collapse, what's the point trying to prop up something that the market's moving away from? You see? And then there was lower cost foreign coal, which is why Thatcher chose the alternative. If your economy is on the verge of an economic collapse, and if your economy is in financial trouble, of course you're going to choose the lower cost foreign coal and turn towards North Sea oil.
To the Labour left, cutting subsidies to loss-making state industry was unforgivable. To Mrs. Thatcher, it was the first step to recovery.
It was failing. She actually had the honesty and the courage to say, this isn't a proper industry. This is make-believe industry. We're subsidising this. We're making it up.
She knew in her mind what had to be done. She knew it was going to be tough, particularly at the beginning in 1979.
I think when she took over in 1979, I think people were beginning to think that perhaps Britain was in an irreversible decline, an economic decline, and she turned that round. She was immensely courageous.
What she said was, actually, this is going to be good for the country. You're going to take the medicine.
And the fact that on the way, people are going to revile you, that doesn't matter at all.
So it comes of no surprise why in the 1980s Margaret Thatcher began the privatisation. It was no different to the housing. Of course, a third of British housing in the year 1980 was publicly owned.
Mrs. Thatcher's battle with the left over state control was in essence a battle between two different visions of the working class. According to the socialists, the working class was oppressed, and the source of that oppression was economic freedom. Their idea of progress was to have the working class living in state housing, travelling on state transport, working for state-controlled industries. Socialists fought not to change, but to preserve traditional jobs and working practices, and working-class communities, as they were called. And in post-war Britain, until Mrs. Thatcher came along, they got their way.
It was so awful. You weren't going anywhere. Your parents lived in a council flat, you were living in a council flat. You had a crappy job, your parents had a crappy job, you were going to have a crappy job. Your parents had a crappy car, you're going to have a crappy car. Your kids, don't worry about that, they're going down the same road. We were basically North Korea, but without the hope.
Now, since it's the private sector that funds the entire economy, of course Thatcher is going to cut down on the size of the public housing. Of course she is. It's the private sector that finances the entire economy.
If we'd lost the miners' strike, we would have been destined to be run by the trade union movement forever. Today, trade union movement, what is it?
With the threat of union action gone, Mrs. Thatcher pressed ahead with privatisation. Moving state industries into the private sector, she believed, would not just revive their fortunes, it would also spread wealth and ownership like never before.
You can't finance the economy off the back of the printing press, unless you want to drive Britain towards hyperinflation. So what Thatcher was left with was a situation, it was a very tough situation because people don't understand it. But she had to, bring in things like the right to buy. And of course the privatisation with regards to the shipbuilding and all the rest of it, and these industries had collapsed. Now that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to let failing industry fail for newer, more efficient industry to come through. That's how you grow an economy. You do not grow an economy by forcing taxpayers to become poorer by paying for something that's going to continue on running at a loss.
Sweden has not always been the country of the welfare state and high tax rates. My country became rich many decades ago when we embraced the principles of the free market. The golden age of economic growth in Sweden began around 1870 and lasted about 100 years. During that period, real per capita income rose sevenfold, giving Swedes the fourth highest per capita income in the world In the 1970s, things began to go wrong, and the Swedish economy began to lag other rich nations. The government gave subsidies to industries in trouble, instead of letting inefficient companies fail and leave room for new and more productive ones. Taxes were sharply increased. At one point, taking into account all taxes, the marginal tax rate was over 100% for some people. All of the new subsidies and benefits resulted in the public sector consuming an even larger share of national output. The 70s was also the decade of new regulations on the labor market, with more protection of workers and more obligations for employers toward employees. The Swedish currency, the krona, was devalued several times in an attempt to boost export industries. This is a bit like peeing in your pants. It's first all warm, but will soon turn cold for a long period ahead. A nasty spiral of even higher wage demands from workers was met with currency devaluations in vain attempts to save businesses. The unpredictability in the economy continued in the 80s, with devaluations combined with expansive fiscal policies, until the country plunged into a crisis in the beginning of the 90s.
What would be the point forcing taxpayers to continuously fund something that's continuously running at a loss? That's not how you grow an economy. And that's why the privatisation had came about. It just so happened to be in the year 1985 that we saw the closure of those pits. And they said that it was Margaret Thatcher's fault for all this unemployment. They said the closure of the pits caused the high unemployment. Well, if you look at the line graph evidence here, you can see for yourself. The evidence is very clear. From 1985 to 1990, you can see the drastic decrease in unemployment. And it just so happened to be in Thatcher's third term as Prime Minister. She ended the Trade Union Congress and in doing so created 3 million plus jobs. It's just coincidental that you can see this line graph evidence. And in relation to that, with the unemployment driving down, it just so happened to be that in 1985 the pits were closed. And this evidence shows clearly that of course Thatcher had reversed one of the most difficult economic time periods in our, history. A lot of people, because they don't understand what finances the economy, they don't understand what a recession is. It just so happens to be that Margaret Thatcher gets the blame for everything. Thatcher was not perfect. There were things that I do not agree with her for. But there are other things that I do agree with her for. And in that period in history, she had no choice. It's the private sector that finances the economy.
Not all the formerly nationalised industries fared well. Some, like coal and shipbuilding, had become so uncompetitive and dependent on government handouts, they struggled to survive. But freed from the burden of supporting loss-making industries, the rest of the economy took off. When Mrs. Thatcher came to power, productivity growth in Britain was among the lowest in the industrial world. Within a few years, it was one of the highest.
Britain was known for suffering from the British disease. Now we're known for having the British cure.
What is surprising looking back is how quickly the Thatcher Revolution transformed Britain. From being the sick man of Europe, the once proud but now ailing giant which had no future, it only took something like 4 or 5 years to turn that around completely.
The message may not have reached the Labour Party, but it certainly reached our friends and competitors abroad. Despite the world recession, despite those long years under Labour, Britain is back in business.
There was a real British economic story that was then told the world over, and that was an incredible legacy that she has left us.
It's why the Labour Party gave up the heavy nationalisation, and why they opted all those years for at least more of a private sector, because they found out Thatcher was right.
To her supporters, the slow, sad decline in her last years stands in stark contrast to her brilliant achievements.
I think her funeral will be a cathartic moment for Britain. I think that the people who try to stick to the despicable anti-Thatcher rhetoric of the time will find that they are completely out of the spirit of the country.
Do you think at her funeral there will be many people lining the route?
I'm sure there'll be loads of people lining the route, and I think you'll have ordinary people there, from taxi drivers to plumbers to cleaners. Proper working class people will be out there, you know, they'll be out there in droves. You know, she's basically transformed Britain, and how some of these, well, arseholes can be going on about that, you know, it's good she's no longer around and things like that. It's just ridiculous. This is one great woman.
If it hadn't been for her, well, God knows what this country would have been in now. I hate to think.
Margaret Thatcher set out both to free the people from the constraints of socialism and to destroy the privileges of the old ruling class. A lover of freedom, herself from a poor background, she swept aside the old class barriers which had kept people in their place. And for that, she is hated and loved.